All right, you guys, welcome to chapter 14, the autonomic nervous system. So we are not quite done with the nervous system yet. We talked about general nervous system stuff in chapter 11, the central nervous system in 12, and the peripheral nervous system in chapter 13. We survived our first exams. So exams 1, lecture and lab, are officially out of the way. The peripheral nervous system is going to stick around a little bit. I've mentioned before because we are starting our peripheral nervous system dissection this coming Thursday. So you will be tested on the peripheral nervous system in the lab portion in exam 2, lab exam 2. You've already been tested on peripheral nervous system in the lecture exam 1. So lecture exam 2 will be autonomic nervous system, endocrine system, and immune system. And the lab exam 2 will be peripheral nervous system, autonomic nervous system, endocrine system, and immune system, okay? And then once we finish exam 2, we are going off to spring break, and then we will come back and start in on the cardiovascular system. So we are almost done with the nervous system. Let's talk about the autonomic nervous system, which is basically the other half of our nervous system that we haven't talked about yet. If you want to think about our nervous system as having two parts, the somatic part and the autonomic part, we've just talked about all of the somatic elements of the peripheral and the central nervous system, okay? Somatic as in the voluntary skeletal muscle and conscious sensory stuff, okay? So it's the afferent stuff, sensory things that we are conscious of, so touch and sight and smell and sound. These things, things that we are consciously aware of. And then on the efferent side, the motor neurons, the motor pathway going to skeletal muscle specifically, so only voluntary stuff. That's all the somatic nervous system. Today, we're going to talk about the autonomic nervous system, which is basically all of the sensory and effector components of the part of your peripheral nervous system in charge of, and central nervous system, in charge of maintaining homeostasis for all of your internal organs. So your hollow organs, your smooth muscle, your heart, your cardiac muscle, and all of your glands, which is all stuff that is pretty much unconscious and involuntarily controlled. Okay, so when we talk about the motor pathways of the autonomic nervous system, we're talking about efferent pathways that are controlling smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands, right? Everything but skeletal muscle, because this is autonomic and not somatic. Okay, so the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS, is different from the somatic nervous system, or the SNS, in several important ways. It affects, like I just said, your smooth muscle, your cardiac muscle, and your glands, as opposed to your skeletal muscle. So this is your somatic nervous system. You've got your heavily myelinated neuron, motor neuron, producing ACH as a neurotransmitter and controlling skeletal muscle by stimulatory effect only, right? So basically, once a signal is received by the skeletal muscle, it's going to contract. That's all it does. There's no like inhibition side. So you're stimulating something. You're stimulating something. You're not inhibiting anything. As opposed to the autonomic nervous system, where you have your smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands being controlled, you're using acetylcholine and norepinephrine as possible neurotransmitters. You've got two divisions for the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic, okay? They work in tandem and antagonistically, which means that they're kind of like, they're forming a balance, but they're working against each other a lot of the time. Antagonistically, as in they work against each other. And the differences between them, we're gonna go over here in a minute. So let's look a bit closer at this chart here, because there's a lot of good stuff to be taken from this. So autonomic nervous system has two parts, parasympathetic and sympathetic. Let's compare the axons of the stuff in the autonomic nervous system. They are more lightly myelinated than the heavily myelinated axons of the somatic nervous system. So that's another difference. They're lightly myelinated because the signal doesn't have to travel quite as fast in the autonomic nervous system as it does in the motor nervous system, or I'm sorry, the somatic nervous system. You've got a couple of different things happening here, as you can see, that's different from the somatic nervous system. In the somatic nervous system, the cell body in the motor pathway of neurons is going to be in the central nervous system, and the axon will be going through the entire peripheral nervous system until it reaches its effector, which is going to be skeletal muscle. Whereas in the autonomic nervous system, you have what are called these autonomic ganglia, which are going to separate what is called the pre-ganglionic neuron from the post-ganglionic neuron, okay? So this is an autonomic nervous system thing. You have one neuron that goes from the central nervous system to the ganglion, and then another neuron that goes from the ganglion to the effector. This is a autonomic nervous system thing, okay? So the autonomic nervous system, both sympathetic and parasympathetic, are going to have a ganglion in between where this motor neuron emerges from the central nervous system, in between there and the effector that it eventually reaches. It emerges as the pre-ganglionic neuron, and it reaches the effector via the post-ganglionic neuron, okay? Let's look a little bit more closely at this. So this image, this chart, is showing you how the parasympathetic nervous system compares to the sympathetic nervous system in terms of where they are located in the bodies and like the general conformation of these pre and post ganglionic neurons. You'll notice that they are very different, and these differences are critical to their function and to just identifying them from each other, okay? So generally speaking, the parasympathetic nervous system is known as your rest and digest part of your nervous system. So your parasympathetic nervous system is the one that is the most active when you are relaxed and not under stress, okay? So we need more of this in our lives, right? The sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight part of your nervous system. It is involved in getting you out of survival situations alive, right? Unfortunately for us, our sympathetic nervous system is often active. It's triggered a lot of the time, a lot more of the time than it would have been for our ancestors who would only have this thing be triggered during like real life or death situations. Our lives today have a lot of stress that is not necessarily directly linked to our survival. However, that stress still activates the sympathetic nervous system. The result of that is literally like wear and tear on your body. So the more that you have this sympathetic part of your nervous system activated, the more stress that you're under, the more adrenaline that is running through your system, the more cortisone, which is the stress hormone that is running through your veins, the harder your body is working. And I hate to say it, but the shorter your life is going to be because of this wear and tear. So I'm going to get a little bit philosophical and a little bit soft and fluffy here, but really, you guys, taking care of your mental health and your emotional well-being is not just an extra thing to do. It is like a thing to help you to live longer and to be healthier. Okay, because if you are constantly activating your sympathetic nervous system, you can have a lot more problems in terms of homeostasis. Your parasympathetic nervous system is activated when you have eaten, when you are sleeping, and when you are relaxed. It's known to be activated when you are meditating. So look into ways to relieve stress. I know that you hear this a lot, especially this last year and a half, but it's really very serious. So really look into stress management techniques. I like meditating. I've actually gotten to the point where I have a daily practice now, and it's changed a lot of things for me, including a massive reduction in my daily stress. So I highly, highly recommend it. If you'd like some recommendations on like meditation apps or where to start, you know, shoot me an email. I'm more than happy to help. But do what works for you. Take a nap, take a bath, get some extra sleep, journal, whatever it is. You got to get this parasympathetic nervous system activated. Okay. So you'll notice that this parasympathetic nervous system, your rest and digest nervous system, it originates both cranially and sacrally. Okay, so we say that it emerges from the craniosacral regions. Okay, so a lot of the cranial nerves that we talked about in the peripheral nervous system lecture are going to come back now, and we're going to take a closer look at which one of those are more involved in your parasympathetic nervous system. But we will see that they are involved in your eye movements, in the activation of your salivary glands, which is part of your digestive system, right? Your heart, when it is active, when your parasympathetic nervous system is active, it's actually actively calming your heart rate, slowing your heart rate. Your lungs, how fast you are breathing. So this slows down your breathing, the parasympathetic nervous system. You can activate, again, your parasympathetic nervous system by literally consciously slowing down your breathing. You can kind of like work the system backwards that way. So try some deep breathing exercises. It activates your stomach when you eat, digest, right? Your pancreas, which is releasing digestive juices, liver and gallbladder. And then down here in the sacral portion, that is going to be controlling your bladder and your genitals, right? Which are both stuff that if you are in crisis, if you're using the sympathetic nervous system, this stuff is going to be inhibited. It's going to be deactivated. This is all stuff that you can do while you're relaxed. It's not critical survival stuff. So you kind of save it for when you have time for it, as opposed to your sympathetic nervous system, which emerges out of the thoracic and lumbar regions of your spine, okay? So all of this portion of the spine where you have the branches coming out, we didn't talk about them because they weren't involved in the brachial plexus or the lumbar plexus, which are somatic nervous system moving the skeletal muscles of your limbs, right? Everything in between there is sympathetic nervous system stuff. So this is all control of your fight or flight response relative to all of these different structures of your body, okay? So dilating the pupils of your eyes, right, when there's a threat. Activating the erector pili muscles, or yeah, in your skin, right, to make all your hair stand up on end. Inhibiting the salivary glands. Your mouth goes dry when you're scared, right? That's because the sympathetic nervous system has been activated. Your salivary glands get basically shut down. Your lungs are going to start working harder. You're going to start breathing faster. Your heart rate goes up. Your stomach shut down. Not important. We're not digesting right now. Blood flow leaves those regions and goes to your heart and lungs and eyes and skin. The pancreas, the liver and gallbladder, adrenal gland is going to be activated, right? Because that's where the epinephrine, the adrenaline, the norepinephrine comes from, right? And then your bladder and genitals, again, not as important, right? We're going to shut that down for right now until we can get out of whatever this stressful situation is. So you will, if you think about it, if you understand how this system, how the autonomic nervous system works, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system, how they are doing this tug of war kind of thing in your body at any given moment, you might start to wrap your mind around maybe symptoms that you're having, right? If you're having trouble with your bladder, if you're having trouble with your heart or your lungs, you know, you might consider how deactivating that sympathetic nervous system and concentrating more on the parasympathetic might help to rebalance your body, right? So again, keeping that stress down, keeping these adrenal glands chill, right? You got to keep them nice and calm. Something else I want to point out about this chart, which is actually really important. It seems like just kind of an arbitrary thing, but it's not. Check out how long the pre-ganglionic neurons are in the parasympathetic nervous system compared to the preganglionic neurons in the sympathetic nervous system. So the ganglia are going to be these synapses right here, okay? So the synapse between the preganglionic and the postganglionic neurons, the ganglia are going to be here on this side of the chart. You've got a whole trunk of them, which we will talk about here in a minute. The preganglionic neurons are very short here and very long. The postganglionic neurons are very long after the ganglia, the ganglion trunk in the sympathetic nervous system. So this difference is critical. It's very important. In the parasympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neurons are very long and the postganglionic neurons are very short. That means that the ganglia are out near the effector, farther away from the spinal cord, for both the cranial and the sacral portions of the parasympathetic nervous system. In the sympathetic nervous system, you'll notice that the preganglionic neurons are very short and the postganglionic neurons travel a long distance to their effector, okay? This has to do with the control of these two systems. So the parasympathetic nervous system, since this is a calming, relaxed state of being, the signal going from the central nervous system to the effector can travel a little bit more slowly, and it can be a little bit more loosely controlled, you might say. You'll also notice that there is a single preganglionic neuron or postganglionic neuron for each of these body parts, okay, for each of these structures here. That is because we don't need to shut down multiple organs at a time the way that we do for the sympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system, we can kind of like pick and choose which organs to ask to relax based on our level of relaxation and our perceived, what we have time to do kind of thing. Whereas in the sympathetic nervous system, these short preganglionic neurons allow for very fast communication with effectors and very fine-tuned control. You'll also notice that for certain of these preganglionic neurons, they're going to control, they can control multiple postganglionic neurons, or multiple postganglionic neurons can control multiple regions of the body. This is because as the sympathetic nervous system is for fight or flight, it is going to need to act very, very fast, which means probably shutting down or activating multiple organs or glands or whatever all at the same time. So like while you are activating the heart, you're going to also be activating the lungs. So you're going to have a lot of control over your heart rate here. You're going to have multiple forms of control inhibition of the stomach region, lots of control over your pancreas, shutting that down, liver and gallbladder. Basically, you have a lot more options with the sympathetic nervous system, but those options allow for you to react quickly and to activate or inhibit multiple body systems at the same time, right? Like in a cascade effect almost. Okay, so let's take a look. Let's review real quick the major differences and add a couple more major differences between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic parts of the autonomic nervous system, okay? So we noticed in the last chart that the origin of the neurons, the origin of the spinal nerves, right, are for the parasympathetic nervous system going to be craniosacral, right? So they are emerging from the cranial nerves, spinal nerves, and the sacral spinal nerves. And in the sympathetic nervous system, they will emerge in what is called a thoracolumbar region. So it basically includes most of the thorax and part of the lumbar regions of the spine. Okay, so the spinal nerves coming from there. The location of the ganglia, which I just got done explaining, right? The terminal ganglia, which is again that ganglion in between the preganglionic neuron and the postganglionic neuron, is going to be within or very much closer to the viscera, or the, in other words, whatever organ gland or your heart. While in the sympathetic nervous system, those ganglia are going to be very much closer to the actual spinal cord itself, meaning that the postganglionic neurons will be very long, right? As opposed to the parasympathetic nervous system, where the postganglionic neurons are very short, right? Because that ganglion is closer to the effector. The parasympathetic nervous system, the postganglionic neurons are very long because the ganglia are close to the spine. They have a longer way to go, right? So parasympathetic, long preganglionic neurons, short postganglionic neurons, and in the sympathetic, short preganglionic neurons and long postganglionic neurons. Okay. In the parasympathetic nervous system, you don't have any ramus communicants. So the rami communicantes for the parasympathetic nervous system are non-existent, and you have gray and white rami communicantes in the sympathetic nervous system, and we're going to talk about those briefly in a little bit, but this is not among the most critical things that I'm going to ask you to know. The really important stuff here for me and therefore for you are going to be the origin of the spinal nerves, the location of the ganglia, the relative length of the pre and postganglionic fibers, the functional role, and the neurotransmitters. The degree of branching for parasympathetic versus the sympathetic nervous system, you have a lot of branching in the sympathetic part, as you can see. And again, that just means that you have like greater fine-tuned control and you're able to do multiple things at once, as opposed to the parasympathetic nervous system, where you have very minimal branching because you can kind of slow down and each one of these things can kind of take their time being controlled. It's not as critical to do that very quickly. The functional role of the parasympathetic nervous system is maintenance functions, conserving and storing energy, quote, rest and digest, okay? So that is like probably the most critical characteristic to remember, right? Between parasympathetic and sympathetic. As opposed to the sympathetic nervous system, which is preparing the body for activity, otherwise known as your fight or flight response, right? And finally, the neurotransmitters involved in each of these. For the parasympathetic nervous system, you're going to be releasing acetylcholine or ACH at both the preganglionic synapse and the postganglionic synapse, where it synapses with the effector. The sympathetic nervous system also uses acetylcholine, but it also uses norepinephrine, okay? So it uses acetylcholine for the, let me make sure that I get this right. Okay, so the preganglionic fibers are all using acetylcholine at that preganglionic synapse. That postganglionic synapse is where you can have either acetylcholine or norepinephrine, depending, okay? And either of those things can have a triggering or an activating effect or an inhibitory effect, depending on what kind of receptor each of these effectors has. So it doesn't depend on what the neurotransmitter is so much as it depends on what receptors the effector has. So if the effector has a certain type of receptor for, say, norepinephrine that causes it to activate when it receives norepinephrine, then it will always activate when it receives norepinephrine. Other places in the body will have different receptors that literally, instead of telling the organ to activate, tell it to be inhibited or to shut down when it receives norepinephrine, that same neurotransmitter. So one neurotransmitter can do multiple things because you have multiple different types of receptors in different parts of the body. It's really cool. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more in a bit. Okay. So these are the important differences between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. The origin of the spinal nerves. Where on the spine do they originate? The location of the ganglia. Is it far away in the viscera, or is it close to the spine? The relative length of the pre and post ganglionic neurons, which has to do with where the ganglia are, and the functional role, of course, of the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic nervous systems, rest and digest, or fight or flight versus rest and digest, and what type of neurotransmitters they use. Parasympathetic, only acetylcholine, sympathetic, acetylcholine, and norepinephrine. Okay, let's get into a little bit more detail about the parasympathetic branch here. So again, you have a relatively long and not very branching, as in, or otherwise known as minimally divergent, but minimal branching pre-ganglionic neurons. The ganglia are close to the effectors, right? So they're close to that whatever visceral organ or gland they are controlling. The postganglionic fibers are short because the ganglia are near the destination. So those postganglionic fibers don't need to go very far. And again, all of these fibers from the spine originate either from the cranial region or the sacral region. In between, you have the thoraco-lumbar region, which is sympathetic, and then you've got things like the brachial and lumbar plexuses, which are somatic nervous system, not autonomic. Okay, remember this guy? So I told you that you could forget about him for a little while, but here we are, no longer. Again, you need to know the names, the numbers, and what functions each of these cranial nerves has. And this time we're going to be looking at this final column here in this chart, right? So the PS is for parasympathetic. So the ones with parasympathetic nerve fibers are the ones that we're going to be focusing on the most here, starting with the oculomotor nerve right here, right? So this guy, I guess a star will have to do, right? So you've got parasympathetic activity as well as motor function activity. This guy is going to be involved in dilating or constricting your, or sorry, that'll be constricting your pupils, right? Because we're talking about the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. Our facial nerve over here, which is number 7, right there, who's right here and here. Okay, oculomotor nerve here and here. Try and color them in a little bit here. The facial nerve is going to be involved in those salivary glands, okay? So in the parasympathetic nervous system, rest and digest, your facial nerve is going to be helping to activate your salivary glands because you're either eating or you can afford to produce saliva, which has an important role other than just digesting your food in your mouth. It helps to protect your teeth and everything too. So it's good to have, but it's not critical when you are in fight or flight. Therefore, fight or flight is actually going to inhibit your salivary glands, right? All right, so next up we have the glossopharyngeal nerve. That's going to be number 9 right here, okay? Glossopharyngeal as in base of the tongue, and your pharynx, which is the back of your nose and throat, okay? So these guys, normally when you are in parasympathetic rest and digest, you can produce mucus and keep these things nice and moist, right? Like normal. You're breathing normally, you're keeping lots of mucus here to keep everything nice and comfy. Our immune system is nice and active. We're catching debris and we are destroying pathogens, all the good stuff that we do in rest and digest. Another reason to keep it in parasympathetic, your immune system is working in parasympathetic nervous system, but it's shut down basically in your sympathetic nervous system. So keep that in mind, as if there wasn't enough, right? Your vagus nerve, this one is super duper important, okay? Cranial nerve number 10, your vagus nerve. This guy heads all the way down. Look at how chunky he is too. It heads all the way down. It's going to actually innervate a lot of the organs in your thorax and abdomen, okay? So the vagus nerve has a lot of different important functions, which we're going to look at here in a bit. And that is it for the ones with parasympathetic fibers, okay? That doesn't mean that you don't need to know the rest of them, you do, but the rest of them have motor, sensory, or mixed, but not necessarily parasympathetic fibers, okay? All right, and just because some of these have parasympathetic fibers doesn't mean that they don't also have somatic, sensory, and motor fibers as well. Remember, your nerves are bundles of axons of neurons. They can be traveling in multiple directions, and they can be carrying multiple types of neurons doing different things, okay? Going different places, doing different things. Think of your nerves as highways that various neuron axons jump on and off of, okay? All right, so here's some more detail on some of these, on these 4 cranial nerves, right? So your oculomotor neuron, that ganglion is called the ciliary ganglion. Again, this is parasympathetic, so we've got a relatively long preganglionic neuron, a relatively short postganglionic neuron. It's going to the eye. You've got your number 7, the facial nerve, here going to your, well, you have one ganglion, and then the nerve is going to branch and go to some major glands of your face, including your lacrimal gland, which is your tear duct, we call, and then also your mucus producing glands for your nasal cavity. Your number 9, the glossopharyngeal spinal nerve, cranial nerve, sorry, it's cranial nerve, is going to go to your, the ganglion is called the submandibular ganglion. You don't need to know the names of these ganglia, but just so you know, the submandibular ganglion is going to go to your submandibular and sublingual glands, which are salivary glands, right? The ones that are below your jaw down here, and the ones that are sublingual, as in underneath your tongue, okay? All right, they also, number 10 now, sorry, number 9 is going to go, yeah, to also the parotid gland. So I'm sorry, so it was number 7, the facial gland does the submandibular and sublingual, as well as the nasal mucosa and lacrimal glands. It is number 9, the glossopharyngeal, that does the parotid, which is basically just another large salivary gland, okay, which is kind of in the back of your throat. All right, your vagus nerve now, check it out. So this is that one really big critical one. It's going to come down and branch to basically all of the major organs in your thorax and abdomen, including your heart, your lungs, your liver, your stomach, pancreas, the your small intestine, and the proximal or nearer to the beginning portions of your large intestine. Okay, so that's a lot of stuff that your vagus nerve is in charge of. So definitely remember that. Cranial nerve number 10, vagus nerve, comes down and branches and controls, and the parasympathetic, it's part of the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system, of the autonomic nervous system. It's going to cause your heart rate to slow, nice and relaxed, your breathing to slow and relax, your liver to activate and go ahead and do its job, which is going to be recycling red blood cells involved in your immune system. Your stomach is going to be activated, allowing you to do the digest part of rest and digest. Same thing with your pancreas, your small intestine, and then the 2 proximal chunks of your large intestine as well, okay? So those are the cranial nerves and all the stuff that they control, just those 4 with the parasympathetic fibers involved. The sacral part of the parasympathetic branch of the ANS is going to be involved in your external genitalia, so like the penis and the clitoris, the vagina, the external vaginal canal, and or internal genitalia, and so testes and uterus, right, ovaries, and then your urinary bladder. Okay, so basically allowing these things, the genitalia and the urinary bladder, to go ahead and do their thing because we got all the time in the world, right? All right. So that's your parasympathetic nervous system. Rest and digest. Long preganglionic neurons, short postganglionic neurons, cranial and sacral in nerve fiber origin, right? Okay, now let's talk about the sympathetic branch a little bit more detail. Sympathetic being your fight or flight portion of your ANS. We have, as you can see by this chart, again, very short preganglionic neurons, long postganglionic neurons, and you've got this crazy line or stack of ganglia just in the thoracolumbar region. Okay, so most of the thorax, a large portion, or a small portion, I should say, really, of the lumbar region of the spine. You've got the ganglia, as you can see, the actual the stack or the trunk of ganglia here extends from all the way up here near the neck to the pelvis, basically, right? This is the sacrum. So down to basically like your hip bone, you've got this trunk of ganglia for the sympathetic nervous system. However, note that the actual origin of the actual spinal nerves come from roughly T1 to L2, okay? So the stack or the trunk, that ganglion trunk, extends farther up, both up and down from where these sympathetic spinal nerves arise from the spine itself, okay? Kind of weird, but it's important. And then of course, we're going to control all the same things for the most part, except for the skin here. I'll reiterate again, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous systems, they both control your viscera, right? So all of these smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands that you don't have voluntary control over. And they control them by creating a balance depending on your situation, right? If you're not in danger, then your parasympathetic nervous system is busy activating or inhibiting body functions depending on that rest and digest paradigm. If you are in immediate danger, or if your brain thinks you're in immediate danger because you have an exam the next day, even though your survival doesn't depend on it, you still are going to have your sympathetic nervous system activated. And that stress is going to activate or inhibit bodily functions depending on fight or flight, right? So activate the heart, activate the lungs, deactivate the genitalia, the bladder, that type of thing. Okay. Here is a close-up of this ganglion trunk, which is pretty weird, right? So the sympathetic trunk is this chain of ganglia that are associated with the sympathetic branch of the ANS, okay? The trunk itself, again, extends from neck to pelvis, whereas the actual fibers arise from approximately T1 to L2, okay? So this makes you wonder, well, what is the deal with these guys and these guys, superior and inferior to the point of origin of these spinal nerves? We're going to get to that, okay? But take a close look at this image here. It seems pretty bizarre, but let me see if I can kind of tease it apart for you. So each one of these is a sympathetic trunk ganglion, okay? And as you'll notice, they're all connected to each other. Again, recall that for the parasympathetic nervous system, each one of these preganglionic nerve fibers basically has its own tract, I guess I shouldn't say tract, but its own nerve really, to the effector, to the ganglion, to its ganglion, which is again closer to the effector. But you don't have a lot of branching again, right? So the parasympathetic nervous system doesn't have a whole lot of branching. You've got a great deal of branching from like this T1 nerve, spinal nerve, right? Because it goes from the spine to the synaptic trunk, and then it's going to have this whole chain of ganglia up here superior to it. So this one nerve fiber at T1 is going to control the eye, the skin, and the salivary glands, like kind of all in one fell swoop, right? It's going to control all of these things kind of together. It's one way to speed up your reaction time for fight or flight. Okay, so each one of these is one of these sympathetic ganglia in the sympathetic trunk. You will notice some things that we have looked at before, right? So again, here's your spinal cord in cross section. You can see the gray commissure here. Remember, your dorsal horns are where the dorsal rootlets and the dorsal root are going to emerge from. The ventral horns are where the ventral rootlets and the ventral root are going to emerge from. The dorsal root turns into the dorsal root ganglion, remember? Please tell me you remember that. The ventral root is going to meet the dorsal root just distal to the dorsal root ganglion, and where they meet, they become the spinal nerve. So remember, the spinal nerve is really like just that part right there. It's like 1 to 2 centimeters. It's a very, very tiny little chunk of nerve going on right there before it splits, right? It splits into the dorsal ramus, which goes back this way, and the ventral ramus, which kind of moves lateral, but it is ventral to the dorsal root or to the dorsal ramus, okay? From this ventral ramus, right, you are going to have a connection to the sympathetic ganglion, okay, to the sympathetic trunk. And which ganglion you're going to be talking to depends on the spinal nerve, depends on that ventral ramus, okay? From that ganglion, you have, of course, more branching to go off to the effector, right? So when I say short preganglionic nerve fibers, this is what I mean. It's literally, that's it. This is the preganglionic stuff here, from this ganglion all the way to whatever the effector is in the body. From here on is postganglionic nerve fiber, and it's going to be very, very long because this is the sympathetic branch, right? This is all, let's see. This is all preganglion nerve, right? So very short. Okay, as opposed to from here on, you've got very long post-ganglionic nerve. I'm looking at my own face. All right. All right, so let's look a little bit closer at what I mean when I say depending on what ganglion it's talking to, right? So again, here we are with our spinal nerve just distal to the dorsal root ganglion and the ventral root. That whatever level this is, say that this is, does it actually say? No, it doesn't say. So say that this is that T1 spinal nerve, okay? So that T1 spinal nerve is going to go on to control, let's say that we're going to be going to the lungs in this example, okay? In this example, that it's a motor neuron, right? It's the autonomic nervous system, but it's still a motor neuron. It's still coming from the ventral, actually it's coming from the lateral horn technically here. The lateral horn of the great commissure in the spine at the level of the, just below the T1 vertebra, right? That nerve, that ventral root becomes the spinal nerve at that level. And in the most simple case, that signal will go straight to the ganglion that it is level with. Okay, so it'll go right to this ganglion right here and go on to the lungs. But that's not always what happens. Sometimes you have a synapse with a ganglion that is above or below the level that that spinal nerve comes from, okay? So that same spinal nerve, instead of going to the ganglion at the same level with it, it might go to a ganglion above where it is, right? Just like, as we see here again, if it's that T1, and we're going to be shutting down the salivary glands because we are going into fight or flight, and your mouth is about to get really dry, right? You might instead synapse with the ganglion right above you, right? Right above the level of the T1 spinal nerve, okay? So you can synapse at the same level, you can synapse above or below, as you can see down here, right? If the L2 nerve fiber synapses below, it might help with the bladder and genitals in a different way than it would if it was going to synapse straight across. And the last way that it can possibly synapse is to synapse with what is called a collateral ganglion. And I don't want you guys to worry too much about this scenario. These collateral ganglia are anterior to the vertebral column, and we're not going to talk about them all that much, but we might see one during our dissection. So I just want you to be aware of them and what they are. So these are just a ganglion that is not part of the that sympathetic trunk that we might be looking for actively. Okay, so you might have these collateral ganglia off over here in some instances. Okay, so that's the third option for sending signals, okay, through the synaptic trunk or otherwise, all right? You can synapse with the ganglion level with wherever you emerged from the spinal cord. You can synapse with a ganglion above or below that level, or you can synapse with a collateral ganglion, which is going to be found anterior or ventral around front of the vertebral column, okay? All right, here is the same chart like this for the sympathetic nervous system, so you can compare them. You can see here, we did have to split it again, but hopefully that's not too weird for you. You've got T1 where the actual nerve, spinal nerves are emerging from the spine, right? The synaptic trunk extends superior to that, however, right? Because that T1 spinal nerve can synapse with the ganglia above. And down below, that L2 spinal nerve can synapse with ganglia in the synaptic trunk below itself as well, right? And again, you can see all the different things that we are concerned with here. I do not need you to memorize which numbers go with which things. What's really most important here is to remember to notice that, check it out, in the parasympathetic nervous system, you are controlling all of the same things as you are in the sympathetic nervous system. You're just controlling them in different ways, okay? You're either, if you're it's not, this is oversimplified, I'm oversimplifying it, but if it's being activated by the parasympathetic nervous system, it's probably inhibited by the sympathetic nervous system, and vice versa. If it's being activated by the sympathetic nervous system in case of fight or flight, then during rest and digest, it's probably being inhibited, okay? During rest and digest, you are inhibiting a fast heart rate, you are inhibiting a fast rate of breathing, but you are activating your digestive system and your bladder and your genitalia, right? Whereas in the sympathetic fight or flight part, you're going to be inhibiting the digestive system, the bladder, and the genitalia, and allowing the heart rate to increase, activating an increased heart rate and increased rate of breathing, right? And dilating your pupils and inhibiting your salivary glands, which is part of your digestive system. So hope that makes sense, okay? Antagonistic, right? We are kind of doing opposites here. We're working with each other, but by working against each other, okay? To maintain homeostasis and survival, both very important things, right? Okay, so now we're going to talk about a little bit about how the sympathetic branch of the nervous system talks to a very important endocrine gland. Actually, the endocrine and the nervous system are very closely linked in the sympathetic branch of the ANS. This is just one endocrine gland that's involved. We're going to talk about a couple others here in a bit. But let's talk about the adrenal gland real quick and discuss norepinephrine and epinephrine. So epinephrine and norepinephrine, they do very similar things. They behave and function very similarly in the human body. They are also known as adrenaline and noradrenaline, okay? I'm not sure why the multiple names, but as far as this class is concerned, you can consider them to be similar enough to not have to differentiate between them, okay? But think of norepinephrine as basically adrenaline, okay? So adrenaline, we know, is the fight or flight hormone. It is the hormone that comes from the adrenal gland, right? Adrenal as in, adrenaline as in adrenal. It's the hormone that comes from the adrenal gland. We call it adrenaline. So I'm just trying to connect the dots for you in case you are not familiar with norepinephrine being adrenaline. It's also epinephrine as in like an EpiPen, right? We inject epinephrine into a person going into cardiac arrest. We can inject epinephrine directly into the heart of somebody going into cardiac arrest, right? That's literally to kickstart the heart, right? You inject this neurotransmitter, this hormone, to initiate the sympathetic nervous system, which causes the heart to beat faster. So we do that to save people's lives, right? Sometimes. Okay, so sympathetic pathways to the adrenal gland. You are going to go through your sympathetic trunk, through a ganglion of your sympathetic trunk, to the adrenal gland, which is located on top of the kidneys, right? The adrenal gland has two different regions. It has a cortex and a medulla, okay? Cortex as in the outer part, kind of like the cerebral cortex is the outer part of the brain. And the medulla is the inner part. Think of like the medullary cavity inside the bones. Remember that, right? So the hollow part inside of your long bones is the medullary cavity because it's inner. The medulla is inner. The medulla oblongata is like in the deepest part of the brain, right? Or well, part of the deepest part of the, I guess you might say the brain stem, I suppose, right? Separate from the cerebrum, if you will. All right. So passing through the celiac ganglion, again, I'm not too worried about the details about that, without synapsing with it. So it goes straight through, okay? So where's our adrenal? So check it out. So if you look really closely here, you'll notice that the preganglionic neuron traveling from the spine goes right through one version or one branch of it will go straight through the synaptic trunk to go to what's called the celiac ganglion, but it will go straight through. So it's basically going straight from the central nervous system to the adrenal gland. This is important for the fast action that we need for fight or flight, right? We are releasing adrenaline, we are releasing norepinephrine. So we need to go straight to the gland that produces it and activate it as quickly as possible. So again, remember like reflexes and stuff, the fewer synapses you have, the faster that signal can go. So we do not synapsing, we do not synapsing, we do not synapse here. Okay. The adrenal medulla is, again, the inner part. The adrenal medulla is going to secrete norepinephrine and epinephrine into the bloodstream, okay? So that hormone going into the bloodstream is going to activate other glands and other bodily structures to go into fight or flight mode, right? Okay. That one is just critical for the sympathetic branch because Fight or flight means adrenaline. Okay, so this is basically that first step, how we get there, how we get the adrenaline in the bloodstream. All right, visceral reflex arcs. So we talked about somatic reflex arcs in some detail, and then you were tested on it. So you understand, hopefully, about the components of somatic reflex arcs, how they basically work. You have a receptor neuron or an in the affector pathway. And then you have the motor neuron in the afferent pathway, and you have an integration center in the spine, right? So again, being a reflex arc, we are doing stuff without input from the brain. We are advising the brain at the same time, but the brain is not telling us what to do. We can go straight from sensory stuff to motor stuff through the spine without ever asking the brain for permission, right? But this is visceral. So this is having to do with your hollow organs, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, okay? Your visceral reflex arcs. So your visceral sensory neurons are mostly free nerve endings that are found throughout like all of your guts in your thoracic or your thorax and your abdominal cavities, okay? So they're going to send information about homeostasis on a lot of levels. So the chemical composition of all of your fluids, all of your bodily fluids, chemical changes in that composition. The stretch of organs. When you eat a hamburger and you stretch your stomach, the cells in the lining of the stomach that are physically stretching send a signal, and it can be a reflex arc that goes through the spine to basically just be like, oh, okay, we got stuff in our stomach now, let's digest it. Okay, so this involves both, this is the autonomic nervous system, right? This is ANS, including both the sympathetic and parasympathetic. Okay, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Okay, so don't feel like this is one or the other. This is both. This is more general. So visceral reflex arcs can involve both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nerve system. You have them for both. Okay, so this is the ANS in general. So information about chemical changes, stretch in the stomach. So that would be parasympathetic, right? Rest and digest. Your body temperature and irritation of the viscera, right? Pain, nausea. All of these things are responses to sensory information coming from visceral sensory neurons, like gut pain, right? And nausea. The reflex itself also involves an integration center in the spine, right? You've got one synapse there. It's a single synapse in the integration center of the spine, okay? You have another synapse, however, over here in an autonomic ganglion, whatever that may be, okay? It might be part of the sympathetic trunk, or it may be a parasympathetic ganglion out closer to the effector. Either way, whatever that autonomic ganglion is, you have another synapse there. So all of these reflexes, all of your visceral reflex arcs have two synapses, okay? Two synapses, one in the integration center and one in the autonomic ganglion, whichever that one is, okay? From that synapse in the autonomic ganglion, you are going to go to your motor neuron, which is going to go to your visceral effector, which again can be a hollow smooth muscle organ, a non-hollow organ, kidney, liver, pancreas, cardiac muscle, or a gland, right? So you have the same components as the same general components as a somatic reflex arc, but the main differences are that you have two consecutive motor neurons. So you have one that is before the autonomic ganglion and one that is after the autonomic ganglion. You should have them different colors, otherwise it's just going to be really weird. Ugh, I made it worse, huh? Because now they look like the same thing. let's fix that. Let's just not. Okay, so that's 1 motor neuron and 2 motor neurons. The afferent signals are from visceral neurons instead of being from somatic sensory neurons, right? Somatic sensory neurons being like your sensory receptors of your skin and your eyes and your ears and your nose and your tongue for taste type of thing, right? And finally, the effectors for a visceral reflex arc are going to be, again, hollow organs, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. ANS kind of stuff, right? All right, let's talk about neurotransmitters, and then we're going to pretty much wrap it up. So I'm going to give you a little bit more detail than you actually need to know here, but this should, I think, help you when we get to the endocrine system. Okay, so this is going to be something that we're going to encounter again anyway. So here we go. Acetylcholine. All of parasympathetic, both pre and post ganglionic synapses, right? So all of your, well, it's all of the autonomic nervous system pre-ganglionic synapses, but it's all of your parasympathetic synapses, both pre-ganglionic and post-ganglionic. And norepinephrine is only in post-ganglionic of sympathetic, right? You've got this weird exception here with the sweat glands. Don't worry about it too much. If you're curious about it, they talk about it in your text. I believe on 543 and 545. 543 to 545 for that weird exception with the sweat glands, but I'm not going to test you on it, so don't worry about it too much. Acetylcholine is transmitted by what we call generally cholinergic fibers. Okay, so nerve fibers that emit acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter are known as cholinergic fibers. And nerve fibers that emit norepinephrine as a neurotransmitter, which is just going to be, again, those post-ganglionic neurons where they synapse with the effector, adrenergic fibers, okay, as in adrenaline, adrenergic. Adrenaline accepting, cholinergic as in acetylcholine. Not accepting, emitting. Getting ahead of myself. Okay. So we're talking about the fibers that are emitting it. Oh yeah, my computer's on fire right now. Okay, not literally, don't be worried. All right, the receptors are cholinergic accepting, cholinergic receptors, which are acetylcholine accepting, and adrenergic receptors, which are adrenaline accepting, okay? So acetylcholine accepting versus adrenaline accepting, okay? So you have a couple of different types of cholinergic receptors and a couple of different types of adrenergic receptors. Your cholinergic receptors can include nicotinic receptors, which are literally receptors that accept the molecule nicotine and things that look like nicotine. So nicotine in cigarettes is a synthetic molecule that was made to fit into these nicotinic receptors, and it takes up these receptors and makes you feel good. That's all that it do. That's why it's so addictive. So all of your postganglionic neurons are all your nicotinic receptors, and the hormone-producing cells of the adrenal medulla. So these acetylcholine receptors, these cholinergic receptors in the adrenal medulla, they receive that neurotransmitter here, and that's what causes them to secrete norepinephrine into the bloodstream. Okay, so don't let that freak you out. This is a post-ganglionic synapse here, where we are using acetylcholine, which makes the receptors here cholinergic receptors. And then what happens once those cholinergic receptors receive acetylcholine is they activate the adrenal medulla to secrete norepinephrine into the blood, okay? So you might be confused about, hey, I thought norepinephrine was a neurotransmitter and now you're talking about it like it's a hormone. Well, here's the deal. A hormone versus a neurotransmitter can be the same molecule, but we call it a hormone or a neurotransmitter depending on what it's doing at the time. And I'm really sorry about that, but that's the way that it is. So norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter when it's being released into a synaptic cleft, wherever. But it is a hormone when it is being released by a gland into the bloodstream, okay, when it's acting as a hormone. So norepinephrine can be a neurotransmitter or a hormone depending on the situation, okay? Any of these molecules can be a neurotransmitter or a hormone depending on where they're being emitted from, basically, okay? So the other type of cholinergic receptors are muscarinic receptors. All of your parasympathetic target organs, so all of your effectors, parasympathetic effectors, and a few of your sympathetic effectors will have these muscarinic receptors. Basically what's happening, what I'm trying to explain here in more detail than you really need to know, is that these multiple types of receptors are what causes the specific effect in that organ or gland, okay? So the heart can receive norepinephrine and be activated to beat faster, while the stomach can receive norepinephrine and be inhibited. And the reason that norepinephrine can have these two different functions is that the receptors for norepinephrine in the heart tell the heart to do something different than the norepinephrine receptors in your stomach. So it's the receptor, okay? When the receptor in the heart, that type of receptor gets norepinephrine, it's an activating neurotransmitter. When the receptor in the stomach receives norepinephrine, that receptor says that norepinephrine is inhibitory. It's going to inhibit the functions of the stomach, okay? So these molecules are able to do multiple different things thanks to the different types of receptors that different organs have for them, for these different molecules, for these neurotransmitters, for these hormones, depending on the circumstances, right? Your adrenergic receptors, the ones that accept norepinephrine, AKA adrenaline. Whew. Let's try that again. Norepinephrine. Okay. You have alpha type and beta type, and literally alpha type is activating and beta type is inhibiting. So literally two different organs can have alpha type versus beta type. And in the alpha type, when it gets norepinephrine, it's going to activate the organ. And if the organ has beta type, when it gets norepinephrine, it's going to shut the organ down. Okay, so same type of thing for both acetylcholine and norepinephrine. You can have different receptors in different organs that cause that neurotransmitter to have different effects on those organs when they receive the same neurotransmitter, okay? I hope I explained that enough and hopefully not too much over to really blow your mind or drive you crazy. All right, so to kind of recap, I got 2 more slides here and then we're done. This is a 1-part lecture, so hey, you're almost done anyway. So the effects of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, parts, I should say, branches of the ANS. are antagonistic. And again, this means that they are working against each other. Right? So the antagonistic effects of the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic are most apparent with the heart, lungs, and digestive systems, right? So your cardiac system is activated by the sympathetic, it is calmed by the parasympathetic. Your respiratory system, activated by the sympathetic, calmed down by the parasympathetic. And then your gastrointestinal, your digestive system is going to be calmed or deactivated by the sympathetic and activated in the parasympathetic, because rest and digest, right? Sympathetic tone. So the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, they're both constantly working, right? Again, we've got kind of a tug of war going on, a balance. The sympathetic nervous system is going to have a constant, it has a constant finger in or on your blood vessels. So at any given time, your sympathetic nervous system is going to basically be controlling your blood vessels. So when the sympathetic nervous system is activated, your blood vessels are going to be dilated in various regions. They're going to be constricted for your digestive system, and they're going to be dilated to bring blood to your skin, to bring blood to your heart, to bring blood to your lungs, to bring blood to your skeletal muscles, all the things that you need to run away and save yourself, right? So the sympathetic nervous system is kind of like in charge of your blood vessels and dilating or constricting them, depending on whether the sympathetic nervous system is active or not, okay? The parasympathetic tone just means that at any given time, the parasympathetic nervous system is the one that's in charge, or that's really kind of handling your heart and digestive tract. So believe it or not, your heart doesn't just naturally beat slowly. Without your parasympathetic nervous system, your heart beats faster, okay? So it's kind of like the default for your heart is to beat really fast, but it is the job of your parasympathetic nervous system to actively calm it down. So the parasympathetic nervous system has to be at work for your heart to be beating slowly. Your parasympathetic nervous has to be at work for your digestive tract to be functioning, okay? So think of sympathetic tone as being like the default. It's like the default for your blood vessels to be, when it's active, for your blood vessels to basically be constricted at your digestive system and dilated for your heart, lungs, skin, and skeletal muscle. In your parasympathetic, the default for your heart is for it to be beating fast, and it's up to your parasympathetic nervous system to keep it going slow. There's a lot of really interesting gives and takes between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. All that this is saying, you don't have to memorize like these specifically, but sympathetic tone is basically just kind of like what the default is for certain things like your blood vessels compared to what the default is in your parasympathetic tone for these other organs, okay? Cooperative effects. So while they have antagonistic effects, they also have cooperative effects. Working with each other versus working against each other, right? Your external genitalia involve cooperation between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system has some other unique roles, functions that are detailed more in your text, but that I'm not going to test you on. So not really going to go over it. That is on page 545, in case you're wondering. Yeah, okay. Lastly, control of the autonomic nervous system, the ANS, okay? The control comes down to, again, oversimplifying, but it comes down to the hypothalamus, okay? So remember our friend, the hypothalamus, hanging out here, anterior and just a little inferior to the thalamus, right? It is going to oversee all of this ANS activity, okay? So everything that happens in your autonomic nervous system goes through the hypothalamus at some point, okay? We already learned about different parts of the brainstem and what they do, generally speaking. And we're talking so much about the somatic nervous system, both central and peripheral, that we didn't really go into any great detail about those. But this is kind of where they come in, right? They come in at the autonomic nervous system. They are a part of the autonomic nervous system. So the hypothalamus, of course, the brainstem is a big one, right? It's going to be controlling your pupil size, right? So sympathetic, right? You're going to dilate your pupils, your heart rate, right? So parasympathetic, when it's at work, it's going to be slowing that heart rate down. Sympathetic, it's going to be allowing it to speed up. Your blood pressure, which is linked to your heart rate, and your blood vessels, whether they're dilated or constricted. Your respiration, your salivation, right? So your brainstem controls controls a lot of different regions that, of course, your both parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system are involved in. Just depends on the situation, right? The spinal cord itself, like literally not even the brain, right? Just the spinal cord straight up is really in charge of your urination, your defecation, erections, and ejaculation. So everything going on really in the pelvis is all like coming straight from just the spine, right? That sacral region of the parasympathetic nervous system, as well as whichever parts down here of the sympathetic trunk that also feed the genitalia and the bladder, as well as the distal portions of the large intestine, right? The rectum for defecation. Those are all associated very closely with really just the spine, okay? So really just like from here to here and here to here. And then of course for the parasympathetic, just literally for here, from here to here. Without even a ganglion, except for down at the effector itself. Okay. And finally, your cortex, your cortical controls, right? As in the cerebral cortex, namely the frontal lobe. Oops. My pen turned off. I wanted to underline that really badly, apparently. There we go. All right, so your frontal cortex is involved in behavior and emotions, okay? Your frontal cortex is where you're going to be placing your focus on if you're going to try to use de-stressing techniques, right? So mindfulness, meditation, controlling actively, like consciously controlling your deep breathing, considering your emotional state, like being self-aware of your emotional state, all of these things, that all comes from the frontal lobe of your cerebral cortex, right? And those inputs, the emotional input is a big one, right? The involvement of your limbic system, which I know we didn't really talk about that much, but it's also involved in the basal nuclei deep in the brain, part of the diencephalon, which we don't even really understand that well, right? All of that plays into your parasympathetic versus your sympathetic nervous system. Emotional distress is still distress, and it activates your sympathetic nervous system the same way that, maybe not the same way, but physiologically, basically the same way that being chased by a tiger does. So do what you can to control the things that you can control, right? Deep breathing, counting, whatever things you need to do to be more mindful of the things that we can control to keep our sympathetic nervous system not quite so active in our lives. And again, feel free to email me if you want to talk about that anymore. I am more than happy to help with that, because I feel like your wellness, we're learning about the physical body here, but the wellness of your mind is just as important. And since we're talking about the nervous system, let's talk about it, right? Why not? We should have a separate discussion for it. Let me know if you'd like to do that. That would be pretty cool. So that wraps up the ANS, okay? This lecture video you'll find here. This week, we are going to be starting our peripheral nervous system dissection. So we're going to be dissecting either rabbits or minks. It depends on what we get in our class. But here is we've got your description and a video for you to watch. So make sure you click through here and get to that. Your homework for this week is another, it's an online lab kind of deal. It's not as, I don't think it's, actually it might be a Labster. So it's going to be another fun Labster one. Let me know if you have any trouble getting it to run properly. Labster is a pretty good tech response support system. So we should get that situated ASAP. So make sure that you can get that to run. Again, there's just the one lecture video here. So I'm going to fix that. Do your reading. Your additional resources. So in my email, my last email after your exams, I said, if you had trouble on this last exam, either one of them, make sure that you are doing all of the additional resources. Obviously, you should be doing this stuff, right? This is kind of the required stuff for a grade. But all the additional resources, if you go through this and at least look at all of these things, you're going to do a hell of a lot better on the exams. Okay, so go through and do the study modules. I highly, highly recommend these 3 videos in particular for the ANS. This is a really good overall intro. And then Hank explains the differences between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems really well in these videos. So I highly, highly recommend watching these to get a better handle on what we just talked about, okay? And as always, let me know if you have any questions. And I will see you guys on Thursday, okay? Stay dry, stay safe, stay well, and I will see you then, okay? Signing off.